Okay, today we're going to go over Anseriformes. This is your week 2 tag group where you'll have to be able to visually recognize tag species. You'll have to understand their taxonomy, their order, family, common name, and scientific name. All these are in the same order and family for this group, so that part should be mostly pretty easy. Um, and then recall some of the natural history and biogeographical information that we're going to talk about with these species. Um, I can't get this to move forward. There it goes. So we have three extant families within this order for this tag. This is Anseriformes. Those families are Anhymety, Anseronatidae, and Anatidae. Now, Anhymety is a small group of three South American species that live in wetlands, and they're pretty cool. Anseronatids are is a is a monotypic family. That's the magpie goose. And then anatids make up basically all of the rest of Anseriformes, and there are a lot of species within the Anatidae. There are 53 genera and like about 174 to 180 species. There's, you know, this is where the diversity in the Anseriformes lies. So in the tag, every single species is an anatid. It's not an anhymid or an anseronatid. So when you see a duck or you know, an eider or a merganser, as we'll see in a little bit, the family is the same for all of them. Generally, in general, ducks can be broken into two groups, dabblers and divers. Dabblers um, have a few diagnostic characteristics that can make them a little bit easier to distinguish from the divers. So they can be told apart. A couple ways you can do this if you watch the duck is to look at how it sits on the water if it is on the water. Dabblers, they float high up in the water, so their bodies are very high. You can see this mallard, its butt is completely out of the water, right? It's not, its body isn't sunk very deep into the water. So that's a quality of dabbling ducks. And when they do their dabbling behavior, which is a foraging behavior, they will either stick their heads underwater a little bit or they'll tilt so that they're tipped completely upside down and their butts will stick straight up out of the water and their heads will be underwater. And what they're feeding is what they're doing. But that's a dabbling behavior. On land, one way you can tell them apart, and I don't have a picture of this, but is by looking at the position of the legs. In general, dabbling ducks have their legs somewhat more centrally located, more forwardly located on their bodies if you compare them to diving ducks. Diving ducks, their legs are farther back. And so what this means is their center of gravity is different and their ability to walk on land is different. Dabblers walk better on land and they don't have to sit their body as high up to walk. If you watch a diver walk on land, what you will see is because their legs are so far back, they have to tilt their whole bodies really far back to position their center of gravity over their legs. So they walk in this very upright manner. Um, Dabblers don't have to do that, but the divers do. Obviously, in terms of foraging behavior, the divers dive. So, um, the divers completely disappear underwater, and sometimes they can be underwater for quite a bit of time foraging. There are exceptions to this. In very rare cases, a dabbler will actually dive. It's not typical, but it's also possible that a diver will dabble. So you can't use this with 100% effectiveness, but pretty much so. If you see a bird doing a dabbling behavior, it's almost certainly a dabbler. And if you see a bird doing a diving behavior, it's almost certainly a diver. Um, it's pretty consistent. All right, so we have, I can't remember how many species to get through. I want to say it's less, like maybe 15 or so species in this group, um, and most of them aren't too bad. So first we have the spotted whistling duck. Dendrocygna guttata is a least concerned species. The spotted whistling duck, you can see one nice diagnostic character. I'm going to put my mouse over here. Is these spotted feathers along the flanks of the duck. These guys are dabblers. They hang out at the water's edge looking for seeds and snails, and they are a nocturnal duck. The spotted whistling duck is found basically in and around Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Bismarck Archipelago. Also can be found a little bit in, if you look right here, northeastern Australia. They are sedentary, meaning non-migratory species of lowland swamps, marshes, and lakes, and other areas, other bodies of water, so long as they're surrounded by grasslands where uh, these these birds will sometimes forage terrestrially. The plumed whistling duck is another member of the genus Dendrocygna, Dendrocygna eatoni, is a least concerned species that does have some conflict with rice field farmers, though at this time its conservation status is least concern. And it is also nocturnal. The plumed whistling duck is a very, very distinct duck. It has these long, pointed plumes, and it has this patch of striping in the sort of, if you would call it, the shoulder area of the bird and onto the flank. The plumed whistling duck is a species of Australia. It is very common in the wet season inland, and then in the dry season, it is not found as far inland because of the dryness. Basically, it's nomadic, moving around with the water availability. And these species are associated with grasslands, meadows, swamps, and lagoon edges. The West Indian whistling duck, another Dendrocygna, Dendrocygna arborea, is a near threatened species, and so this is our first species where there's some question about what impacts are causing harm to this species and its population stability. And well, there's a couple. First, wetland destruction within its range in the Caribbean, and also policy implementation in terms of. So there was a time when these ducks were a problem in rice fields, or at least rice farmers considered them problems. And so on at least one island within the Caribbean, there was a policy implemented where you could hunt these ducks in rice fields. Uh, and so obviously that hunting had a negative impact on this species. And somewhat ironically, though maybe not surprising, the damage to the rice fields was far greater from the hunters than it was from the ducks themselves. So they should have just left the ducks alone. In terms of diet, they are really, they consume a significant amount of royal palm fruit. But they also do consume berries, grass seeds, and grains. Like I said, this is a Caribbean species, though some of the islands that it was once found on, it has been extirpated from. It is generally considered sedentary, non-migratory, but they do move between islands and are primarily found in mangroves and shallow wetlands like a rice paddy. Bar-headed goose, Anser indicus, is a species of least concern, though was previously listed as near threatened, and is generally herbivorous, eating things like seaweed on the coast. It will also take some number of small insects and crustaceans, so they do have a little bit of variety in their diet. And for the most part, with the vast majority of these annatid species, that will be the case. Even some of the most stringently herbivorous of the annatids does occasionally eat an insect or something else. Aren't really many at all that you can say never eat any invertebrate at all. Some of them eat vertebrates as well, which we will see. So the bar-headed goose is basically in the breeding ranges, Mongolia and China, in high elevation wetlands, and then it winters in places like Pakistan, India, and Myanmar in lowland freshwater systems. Snow goose, Anseriformes, is a least concerned species. In fact, is an incredibly abundant species that is a primarily herbivorous, vegetation-eating goose. These guys have 3 distinct breeding populations within their North American range, which are somewhat reflected in the 3 yellow stripes you see on that map. Those yellow stripes represent the migration paths of the distinct populations. They breed primarily in the tundra of the Arctic coast and also on the various islands within the region of the Arctic, on ponds, lakes, and streams of those islands. And they winter in freshwater and brackish waters throughout the U.S. and down into Mexico. The nene goose, Branta sanvicensis. This goose is actually much more commonly called the Hawaiian goose. So you will notice many times throughout this semester when I'm telling you what the names of these different birds are, that I will have something on the slide somewhere that says AKA and a new name. AKA is also known as, and in this case, also known as the Hawaiian goose. Um, this name, I will only give the alternate name when it is the more authoritative common name. Now, obviously, with common names, there's not necessarily an authoritative name, but these are called Hawaiian goose much more than nene goose. And so that's what I mean by that. So nonetheless, for the purposes of the exam, go ahead and learn the tag name. Just understand that this name is very likely the name that you will encounter outside of the zoo world. So the species is near threatened. It's a species of Hawaii where the mongoose is an invasive mammal that um, is a predator to these birds, and so that's a big deal for them. Obviously, you have an unchecked predator killing a lot of those individuals, and um, that suppresses their populations. And in fact, their populations are really only sustained through releases of captive reared birds. Their populations are not particularly self-sustaining in the wild, um, just because of the relative vegetation quality in the habitats that these individuals now live in, and because of this invasive mongoose. So this individual is being sustained through captive breeding programs. The diet is based, it's vegetation based, but it changes a lot on the different Hawaiian islands based on what vegetation is locally abundant. So it shifts in different habitats that you find these guys in. And so again, they're in the Hawaiian archipelago. They move elevationally, so they're non-migratory, but they do have an elevational shift. And they live in grasslands at various elevations, and there's a lot of difference at what elevations they live in. It really depends on the island, so there's a lot of difference between islands. In general, their habitat needs are kind of poorly understood. At least the baseline habitat needs are, and that's because we don't have records of what these birds were doing prior to their habitats being significantly altered by humans. So we don't really know what the baseline habitat looked like for this species. The red-breasted goose, Branta ruficollis, is a vulnerable species. Uh, it is vulnerable for a number of reasons, one of which is a lot of its habitat has been converted into vineyards. Another is the decline of raptors, which is a very interesting thing I'll talk about in a second. And also hunting. People have traditionally hunted this particular goose. So when I say raptor decline, that might seem counterintuitive. Why would a decline in a large predator also cause a decline in this species? Well, the red-breasted goose would typically build its nests in places where these raptors existed. One of the important predators of the red-breasted goose is actually the fox. Foxes attack these guys. Um, and it turns out that things like peregrine falcons and rough-legged hawks that they would nest near will attack a fox if it comes near their nest. So if they nest in the same place as the raptor is very vigilant and able to attack a fox and push it out of that territory. So they sort of get a free security guard. Because if their nest is near the raptor's nest, the raptor will chase down a fox if it's in the area, and then they don't have to deal with that fox anymore. But those raptors, where they have declined, um, you don't have that free security guard anymore in some situations, and so you have greater predation risk. Their diet is primarily grasses, sedges, and cereals like wheat, barley, and corn. These guys are found in the Taimyr Peninsula and other areas of Russia, a couple other peninsulas primarily. And this is a shrub lichen tundra. That's what this area is primarily composed of. And then they overwinter in southeastern Europe and Turkey and mostly croplands of that area. The trumpeter swan, Cygnus buccinator, is the only swan listed in the tag online as a least concerned swan that consumes submerged and emergent vegetation as well as fish and is known to sometimes eat fish eggs as well. These guys breed mostly in Alaska and Canada, and they breed on freshwater marshes, ponds, and lakes, whereas they overwinter in the Gulf of Alaska and the northern United States in various areas of open freshwater. In any case, wherever they breed, they need to have at least 100 meters of room for takeoff. So that's an important aspect of their habitat selection. The Orinoco goose, Oresichon jubatus, is a species of least concern. It's primarily herbivorous. They have a strong preference for clumped grasses in a habitat where those are available, and they are also known to eat worms and insects. So this is a species of South American lowlands. This is primarily found in 3 different basins: the Orinoco Basin, the Amazonas Basin, and the Tocantins-Araguaia basins. They require terrestrial grazing areas with access to fresh water. So they basically they hang out around fresh water, and then they forage in grasslands, particularly places with those clumped grasses. So they kind of walk around like little feathered cows munching on grass. And they do wander throughout the range outside of the breeding season, primarily as a means. This is not so much migration, but it is as a means of moving between areas with abundant food availability. So more like nomadism. The Andean goose, Orestich melanopterus is a species of least concern that is known to eat alfalfa, clover, and cereals, particularly in agriculture areas as well as in more wild meadows. And so there's your Andean goose. This is a species that you find in a fairly narrow range of the Andes within central Peru and Argentina, well, south through Argentina and Chile as well. It breeds between 3,000 and 5,400 meters, so we're talking about a high elevation species. And for the most part, it doesn't migrate. It does move from high elevations to low elevations in the southernmost extent of its breeding range. That far south, the high elevation Andes in that area are extremely harsh in the winter, so those birds have to move from high elevation areas to the lowlands in the wintertime. The Indian pygmy goose, which is much more commonly known as the cotton pygmy goose, is Notapus coromandelianus. This is a species of least concern and primarily eats vegetation and invertebrates occasionally, and even very occasionally, a fish, a small fish. So the cotton pygmy goose is found in eastern Pakistan through southern China, and then through Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and even down into eastern Australia. Its movements are fairly poorly studied, so that's the case with several of these birds, where the movements aren't that well known, but we have some information. Basically, that we know that there is migration from their breeding range in southern China. As you see here, this is the. I gotta put my mouse over here. The breeding range is, of course, this orange part of the map, and they move from that into other parts of the range where they can survive the winter. They prefer shallow water with floating and submerged vegetation, so shallow ponds and lakes and even lagoons. They are rarely seen in like marshes and swamps, slow rivers, rice paddies, mangrove swamps, places like that, and are known to occasionally be abundant on deeper lakes when those deeper lakes have marshy edges with that sort of emergent vegetative quality of a marsh. The African pygmy goose, Nodapus auritus, is a species of least concern. They eat seeds of various aquatic plants, especially water lilies, and herbaceous parts of other aquatic plants, and some small amount of invertebrates and small fish. This is a species of sub-Saharan Africa, basically all of sub-Saharan Africa, south to Madagascar and extreme southeastern South Africa. So anytime you see a distribution map and you are looking at Africa and you see a line that moves horizontally in this region, the limiting factor of the northern part of the range is the Saharan desert up here. They are generally sedentary. They do become nomadic in the dry season. In other words, they follow the water, right? They're following the water. They prefer still or slow water. That ranges from things like swamps and marshes, ponds, lakes, slow rivers, any of those, so long as there is abundant vegetation available. The Brazilian teal, Amazonetta brasiliensis, is a species of least concern. I like this particular picture from eBird because with the Brazilian teal, if you look at it without the wing open, it looks just essentially a warm brown color, which is what you see. What you see in this picture here. It just looks like this. You can't see any of this color when the wing is closed, but when the wing is open, you can really see the beauty of the colors that this bird possesses. Many ducks actually are like this. They hide some incredible color in their wings. The diet for these guys is somewhat unknown. Basically, there's not been any really robust dietary studies, but they eat a mixture of fruits, roots, seeds, and invertebrates. This is a species of South America and is found in countries including Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Bolivia. So you have this up here. I keep moving my mouse off the screen. Um, right here you've got Colombia, right in Venezuela, and then here you've got well, Paraguay primarily. Or I'm sorry, that's not Paraguay. That's Guyana. Paraguay is down here. Um, and these these distributional areas here represent a specific subspecies called Braziliensis. So that is the species you find in Venezuela, Colombia, and Guyana are all a specific subspecies, and then everything down here in Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Bolivia are a different subspecies called Epicuteri. And those two different subspecies can be told apart by their physical size. The individuals that are in the southern range here are much larger. So the Epicuteri subspecies is a much larger subspecies than Braziliensis is. And what's interesting is this southern Epicuteri subspecies will migrate in the winter, and it will migrate. Well, it migrates in the fall to avoid the winter, but it will migrate up into these the northern subspecies, the Braziliensis range, to avoid the harsh conditions of farther southern South America, down in Argentina and Uruguay. And so you get a period of time in every season where you have overlap in these two subspecies distributions. The puna teal, Spatula puna, is a species of least concern that eats aquatic plants and invertebrates. It is found essentially in south central Peru, down into northern Argentina, also in Bolivia and Chile. It is sedentary except for some of the high altitude individuals. Excuse me, so high altitude, high elevation individuals will move into lower elevations in the winter to avoid the harsh high altitude conditions, and they prefer alkaline wetlands with abundant vegetation all the way up to 4,600 meters, so pretty high elevation. The Chiloe widgeon is Myreca sibyllatrix. It's a species of least concern. And these guys mostly consume plant material, some invertebrates and fish, and mostly they're, from a behavioral standpoint, they eat by grazing on dry land. The interesting thing about a lot of ducks is that they do that. They walk on the dry land and graze. It's a species of southern South America where southernmost individuals migrate to the northern part of the range in winter. So if you look at their range here, if you're a Chiloe widgeon way down here, you will actually migrate up here. But the ones that are, say, here are less likely to migrate because it isn't as cold here as it is way down here. And they prefer shallow freshwater bodies with scattered trees and nearby grasses. And the grasses, of course, are where they graze. The northern pintail is an absolutely fantastic duck. Anasacuta is a species of least concern that feeds on grains, tumors, seeds, and some invertebrates. And it's called the pintail because in the male here, if we take a look, you'll see these longer feathers that stick out really, really far in the tail. That's the pintail. And I should say, I guess now's as good a time as any to say this. We're only looking at pictures of males here. If you look at the female ducks, they are um, in many of these at least sexually dimorphic species, they're more difficult to distinguish. Um, but the males tend to be very easy to distinguish. That's what will be on your test. So the distribution, this is basically a bird that breeds in the far northern parts of the northern hemisphere from about 40 degrees to 75 degrees north latitude. So 75 degrees north latitude is about, or it's it's about right here. That's about the northern extreme. Um, this is above the Arctic Circle. It's when you get up to 75 degrees north latitude, you're getting into some pretty cold, wicked, unhospitable places. They migrate, and they migrate tremendous distances. They migrate as far south as like places like Colombia, Venezuela, Central Africa, and the Maldives. So here you've got Colombia and Venezuela, Central Africa. Here's the Maldives, southern India. Um, so they're going sometimes from as far north as the southern extent of the Arctic Circle down to like the Maldives. That's crazy. That's a heck of a migration. They breed in open areas with intermittent wetlands and low vegetation, and they overwinter in shallow marshes with emergent vegetation. One of their favorite breeding places would be something like a carex meadow, just to give you an idea of what type of breeding habitat I mean by intermittent wetlands with low vegetation. The Madagascar teal, so this is more commonly called Bernier's teal. Uh, so it is from Madagascar, but if you were to Google this species and you type in Madagascar teal, it's usually going to show you Bernier's teal instead. So it's Anis bernierii. It is an endangered species with less than 2,000 individuals remaining in the population. Some things that have affected this species are hunting, egg collecting, and habitat conversion into rice fields. And you can see Bernier's teal is a rather nondescript species with a sort of reddish brown eye. Otherwise, it's a fairly plain looking duck. And so here's Bernier's teal's distribution within Madagascar. If you were to look at subfossil specimens from across the island, you would see that historically the bird was found throughout Madagascar. But currently it is restricted in range to the western coast of Madagascar. It nests in seasonally flooded non-tidal areas. In other words, areas that are not influenced by the tide. So a little inland from the coast where the tide's going to influence those water levels. And primarily it nests within areas of white mangrove, or sometimes called gray mangrove. And mangrove is just a type of tree. There are different mangrove trees, if you're not familiar with that. They often will move to coastal wetlands in the non-breeding season. So when the tide is not as big of a deal, they'll move into areas that are influenced by the tide. The marbled teal, also known as the marbled duck, Marmaronetta angustirostris, is a near-threatened species, and this has a particularly interesting conservation thing going on. Many species of ducks are threatened by habitat conversion of wetlands, either wetlands into natural wetlands into things like rice paddies, or wetlands being drained for irrigation, like in this species. Or a particularly interesting story with the marbled duck is the story of the Mesopotamian marshes, because within its very scattered distribution, which we'll take a look at in a minute, one of its core areas of distribution particularly overwintering, would be around the Mesopotamian marshes. In 1991 or so, there was an uprising, an Awari uprising, in uh, during the reign of Saddam Hussein. And so these people rose up and they tried to overthrow the government. And Saddam Hussein, well, he did not take very kindly to that. They did not succeed. And his response was these people relied on the Mesopotamian marshes. They're strongly tied to their cultural ideals and beliefs, and also it's like where they lived and where they harvested food and things like that. And so what Saddam Hussein did was he went out and he drained those marshes as um, revenge for that uprising. Unfortunately, that affected obviously all the things that lived in the Mesopotamian marshes as well. And the marshes were not completely drained, but they were dramatically drained. I mean, so I can't remember what the numbers are now. I don't want to make numbers up, but it's something like 70% of these tremendous wetlands were drained during this time. And so, of course, he did get, in many ways, his revenge from that Awari uprising, but he also had hugely tremendous negative effects on the wildlife that relied on those wetlands for survival. And so that happened throughout the 1990s. There have been, since that time, many efforts to restore some of the Mesopotamian marshes, and some of that work has happened. But that has definitely negatively affected the marble duck. Um, so the distribution, they can be found in Northwest Africa, in the Middle East, right? That's where your Mesopotamian marshes are over here, um, and in uh, parts of Asia up to and including Central Asia, way out here in China. You've got a potential breeding population. So they have an interesting and scattered breeding and overwintering range. They are nomadic after the breeding season, following water, and they're thought to have a southward migration in general, but their movements are not very well studied. And their preferred habitat, for the most part, are brackish wetlands. The common eider, Somateria mollissima, is a near threatened species that has a lot of things going against it. Um, it has in various parts of its range, which you will see in a minute, is a substantial. Basically, it's coastal northern hemisphere. Um, they have been hunted in parts of their range. In some areas of their range, like the Gulf of Alaska, where there are significant shipping activities going on, there's actually chronic oil contamination, which affects these birds. General heavy metal bioaccumulation is a big deal for these birds. Competition with fisheries and gill nets. So the oil contamination and heavy metal bioaccumulation is a big deal, due primarily to the sublethal effects that it has on these birds. So when I say sublethal effects, what I mean is not necessarily killing them outright, but what it does is things like lowering fecundity and lowering um, life expectancy in these species. Obviously, that has negative effects overall on population levels in these birds. Fisheries competition is an interesting one. Um, these birds primarily eat benthic invertebrates, things like mollusks and crustaceans, and they eat some fish as well. Our fisheries industry also likes to go out and take large numbers of mollusks and crustaceans and other of this species' preferred foods. And so this bird literally has to compete with, giant ships with giant nets collecting, these sorts of things. It's not always ships with nets, depending on the collection method, Uh, but it has to compete with humans for its food. So that is one of the struggles that it has. Gill nets themselves are a problem for this bird as it dives down and can get caught in gill nets and drowned as well. So this bird just has a lot of things that are going against it, and that's why it is a near threatened species. One of the advantages it has is its tremendous range across the majority of the northern hemisphere. So even when things are bad in one place, potentially things are going to be okay somewhere else in its range, and that can act as a sort of population reservoir, hopefully, for the species. These birds, their movements are a little more well studied, but not in terms of movements, but not. There's still a lot of questions about their movements, particularly as far as their movements to wintering areas. But they show strong phylopatry to natal areas, and so what they do is when the a male and female pair up, the male follows the female to her natal area, and they will breed at that natal area. So, and every season the male can get a new pair partner, but the male always follows the female to her natal area, and so that's what phylopatry is. It's the instinctual drive to go back to the place you were born to have offspring, and that's what they do. It is believed that they probably do the same thing for their wintering areas, right? So these individuals may also show a strong preference to go back to the same overwintering areas every year. But again, this is understudied. Their habitat is marine. They like rocky coastlines or areas up to 6 kilometers inland, as long as they have in during breeding season access to fresh water for brooding purposes. The hooded merganser, one of my very favorite anatids. They're fairly common in our part of the world, well, in my part of the world, depending on where you're from, and they're beautiful, and they're fun to watch, and they're a little bit silly, which is something I like about them. Lophodites cuculatus is a species of least concern that eats fish, crustaceans, insects, and amphibians. So it is, quite predatory. Um, they do eat relatively little amounts of vegetation as well. I think it's something like about 4% of a hooded merganser's diet is vegetation, but like 44% is fish. And of crustaceans, the vast majority, we're talking about crayfish. They eat a lot of crayfish. Distributions: North American, breeding throughout eastern North America and in the Pacific Northwest and in forested wetlands specifically. And then they overwinter mostly throughout the southern U.S. In emergent marshes, ponds, rivers, and creeks. Basically, they don't overwinter typically on really, really large bodies of water. So when there's a big freeze, they might get pushed to a larger body of water. And our last species in this lecture is the scaly-sided merganser, Mergus squamatus. This is an endangered species that is threatened by commercial logging within its range in China and Russia, gold mining causing pollution in many of the waters that it prefers, problems with siltation, which affect its ability to hunt when it dives, and also fish nets, which can cause drowning. And the diet is primarily small fish and aquatic invertebrates. So in terms of range, this is a species that is found in up here in China and Russia, also in um, parts of the Korean Peninsula here, and then overwinters in the Korean Peninsula, southern China, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, and Myanmar. So basically sort of East Asia-ish in terms of its distribution. And the cool thing about this species is their preferred habitat is actually forested, clear, low, little impacted by human mountain rivers and fast-moving streams, preferably with islands on them. And so I kind of think of these guys in bird terms. They're kind of like, well, if we converted bird terms into fish terms, I mean, they're kind of like brook trout that like fast moving mountain waters. which is kind of neat and not what you think of when you think of a lot of these species. So that is the tag species for this week. If you have any questions, reach out to me.